In this video, we'll look at comparing runoff voting and instant runoff voting using an example. In this example, a youth group is planning to go to a professional sporting event. There are 4 options they are considering: a football game, a basketball game, a baseball game, and a soccer match. The kids rank their preferences for each sporting event, and the following preference schedule shows the results. Now, one thing to note, I am abbreviating football game with an F, basketball game with an H, baseball with a B, and soccer with an S, just to make it easier in the table. Now, before we do any kind of runoff, it's important to note that runoffs only happen if no one gets a majority in the initial first choice vote. So let's look at our first choice votes. So that would be the votes in the top row, and then the first choice, which would be in the second row down. So let's look at each of these sporting events in turn, and I'll just start on the left side of the table and move along. So what we have here is the first person saying football, and then 3 more people saying football as their first choice. So that would be a total of 4 votes for football. The next, as we continue from left to right, we have H for basketball, and there are 3, and then there are 4 more as you look a little further down, so that's a total of 7 votes for basketball. As I continue on, there's soccer, I have 2, and then baseball finally rounds out the table with 5. Okay, now to determine whether we have a majority, we'd want to add up all the people who are voting. So when we add this up, we get 18 voters. So 18 kids voted. A majority would be more than 50%, so just more than half. So if we look at half of this, that would be 9. We can't have half, we need to have more than half, so you need at least 10 votes for a majority. Okay, so that's important to note. And when we look at our first choice votes, no one had a majority. So there was no majority. The game that actually had the highest was hoops or basketball. So if we were using a plurality, basketball would win. But what we want is a majority of the votes going to one of these sporting events. So this is when a runoff starts to happen, is when you don't have a majority. So let's look at 2 types of runoffs. First off, let's consider top 2. Now, as the word or phrase implies, top 2 runoff is when you look at the top 2 candidates based on the first choices. So the 2 sporting events in this case that had the highest numbers were basketball and baseball. So I'll just go ahead and put that what their initial votes were, which is basketball had 7, baseball had 5 votes in terms of first place. And then what you have to do is you have to redistribute the votes that went to the other 2 sports. So we have to redistribute football, those 4 votes for football, and we have to redistribute those 2 votes for soccer. Let me clear off the table just a bit here from my scratches and highlights, and then I can highlight the important parts here. Let's start with football. Okay, so football, we had 1 person in this first column that had picked football as their first choice. Well, if football is out of the running, then that 1 person would choose H for hoops or basketball. So you would have 1 of those votes going to basketball. Let's continue on. If we look at the next group that said football, that would be this group. 3 people said football as their first choice, but they had a second, or they had a different second choice. In particular, if football isn't around, then they would choose baseball. So those 3 people would go for baseball. Okay, so 1 of the people who said football would go for basketball, 3 of the people who said football would go for baseball. Then let's look at soccer. So we've taken care of these football folks. Let's now look at the soccer folks. the place where we had soccer in first choice were the two people kind of in the middle of the table here. And if they can't do soccer, then their next choice is football. But football's out of the running, so they can't do that either. So we actually go to their third choice, which is baseball. So these other two people who originally said soccer, they would choose baseball over basketball. And so now we've redistributed all of the votes from football and soccer, and we total that up. Basketball gets 8 and baseball gets 10, and there's a majority. So the idea with a runoff is that you're trying to achieve a majority, and once you do, you're done. So in this case, baseball wins. Okay, that's the choice. So in top 2, we eliminate everyone right off the bat except for the 2 people who got the most first place votes. The other technique that we've talked about in class is instant runoff voting, or sometimes IRV is the abbreviation. Instant runoff. In instant runoff, instead of eliminating everybody but the top 2, you eliminate the candidates who got the least votes one at a time. So let me again clear this off so that I have a nice clear board here, you might say. So now remember, I had 4 football folks, I had 2 soccer folks. Originally I was eliminating both of those, but now I'm not going to eliminate football, I'm only going to eliminate soccer first. So eliminate the lowest first. So we're actually going to have at least 1, maybe 2 runoffs here, because we're going to eliminate low votes one at a time. So in our first runoff in IRV, we would, instead of having just 2 candidates, we would have football, basketball, and baseball. The only one that is eliminated is soccer. So football originally had 4, basketball had 7, baseball had 5. Where do these 2 votes go? Well, if we come up to the table, those 2 people who voted for soccer, if they can't choose soccer, they would choose football. So those 2 votes go to football. That was the only thing we had to redistribute. So now football has 6, basketball has 7, and baseball has 5. Again, no one has a majority, so we can't stop there. We need to keep going. What we now do is eliminate the lowest. So in our second runoff, we have to eliminate whoever got the lowest next, and that would be baseball. Baseball is now the lowest, so even though they won in top 2 runoff, they're now the lowest because the soccer votes went to football, and that made football have more votes than baseball did. So now we're going to have a final runoff with football and basketball. Now football in the last election had 6 and basketball had 7. The question is, where do those 5 votes go? So we're going to redistribute the baseball votes. When we look at those baseball votes, they were right here in the very last column. Those 5 people all voted for baseball. If baseball doesn't exist, they would go to soccer, but soccer doesn't exist anymore. So the next option down would be football. So those 5 votes from baseball actually end up going to the football, and football gets 11 votes, which now is a majority. Remember, you need 10 or more to make a majority. So in this case, football wins. So here you see an example where if we were doing plurality, basketball would win. But because basketball doesn't get a majority, in many situations, many elections force a runoff. And depending on the type of runoff, you may get the same result, or you may, in this example, get 2 different results. In top 2 runoff, we go to a single runoff with just 2 candidates. So think top 2 candidates. With instant runoff voting, you actually have a series of runoffs until someone gets a majority. In that series, you only eliminate 1 candidate at a time. So there's an example of the 2 runoff methods, and I hope this kind of clears up the difference between the 2.